This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We're counting on you. Every week we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, and other things that we find interesting. And this episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany will be holding the EU presidency in the second half of 2020. And the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries with their generous support.
And we are very pleased today to welcome Ambassador Oded Eran, who is currently a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, connected with Tel Aviv University. He served as the director of the INSS from July 2008 to 2011. Between 2002 and 2007, Oded Eran served as Israel's ambassador to the European Union, covering NATO as well. Prior to that, between 1997 and 2000, he was Israel's ambassador to Jordan, the head of Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians. During that time, he served as Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and many other positions. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics, and we'll be discussing various articles of his on Israeli foreign policy, including annexation, COVID, regional affairs, everything important. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for interviewing me.
I would like to start with your personal impressions of Israeli foreign policy. You've been an ambassador in some very sensitive positions, Jordan and the EU, under very different kinds of governments, both the Sharon government, the Olmert government, before that, both Ehud Barak and Netanyahu in his first term. How do you think Israeli diplomacy and foreign policy has changed during those different times and regarding those sensitive places?
Well, I think that there is a constant in our foreign policy, which is strongly linked to the security policy, and that is the reliance, maybe too much reliance, on the U.S. This has been central in our overall strategic posture ever since 1967. We went to war in 1967 with French equipment and armament, but today you won't find even a rifle from France or any other European country to the extent that we have anything foreign in our army. It's the United States. The only Security Council permanent member who casted a veto on draft resolutions against Israel was the United States, and this is a major consideration for the Israeli Foreign Office and the Prime Minister and Defense Minister calculations.
Why do you think that's a precarious situation?
Because, on the one hand, there were very few instances where we were let down by the United States. But we have to take into consideration that there are deep, profound demographic changes in the United States overall population. And secondly, the Jewish community is distancing itself in recent years from both Judaism and Israeli issues. And the combination of that and the rise or the heavier weight of minorities in the United States in the long run is going to be very problematic if Israel doesn't change key elements in its relations with the Arab world and especially the Palestinians.
But Ambassador, what about the closer ties with emerging superpowers like India and China? Could that not substitute for the, as you say, overwhelming reliance on the United States?
These relations with the rising economic powers certainly China, India, South Korea, Singapore, Australia. These relations are very important, but none of these countries can be a major supplier of advanced weapons. Only China is a member of the Security Council. And let me draw your attention. Last week, China voted against a resolution in the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, against a resolution which censored Iran for its nuclear activity. We have strong economic relations, but even these relations are subjected now to a very close scrutiny by the United States. It's becoming a problem because of the rivalry between these two superpowers. And I wonder how long we can maintain the relations. Certainly, when China has not changed the pattern of its vote, every now and then when Israel comes to be debated in the international fora. It's not a substitute. It can never be one. And it has certain advantages, but these are coming with some liabilities in Chinese posture on Israeli-related issues, supply of arms to our adversaries, problematic.
It seems to me that you're subscribing to that principle that arms supplies is really the key, the centerpiece of Israeli diplomacy and Israel's diplomatic needs. But there's a certain paradox in that, because you say that the way to ensure a constant supply of arms from the United States is to move ahead diplomatically with the Palestinians and the other Arab countries, which means, I think, that there would be less need of a constant arms supply.
I think that there is a problem. Until now, we somehow managed to square the circle. That is to say, although the U.S. various administrations' position on the Arab-Israeli conflict conflicted with some of our actions and attitudes on these issues related to our relations with the Palestinians, we maintained a close relationship, but we have to remember that our policy, this government, or recent government policies, are not necessarily the same or identical to those of the United States. Even look at the Trump proposal or deal of the century, as it's nicknamed. There is a very important element in it. It's a two-state solution, and the current Israeli government seems to be in difficulty swallowing the element of the two-state solution. It's willing to go along with the annexation of up to 30%, but it is unable to, and I don't understand why, but there it is. It's unable to accept the two-state solution, which is one of the elements in the Trump proposal. And so there is a conflict, inbuilt-in conflict between the two states, and this will be underlined, emphasized, if and when a Democrat president is in the White House. This can happen on November 3rd when the United States goes to elections, and it is quite possible that the Democrats will take control of the two houses of Congress. And even if Trump is re-elected and the two houses are under the Democratic control, this is a recipe for a confrontation if we don't adjust ourselves to some of the American position.
Well, I'm curious about what you think if there is a change of power in the U.S., and I would not take it for granted personally. You're not going to catch me making any predictions about what happens in November, at least not now. But if there is a change of government and a change of the presidency back to a Democratic president, I mean, I'm curious to hear your analysis of what you think a Biden presidency would really mean for Israeli policy, especially vis-a-vis the Trump plan and the two-state solution. I mean, previous Democratic leadership in the U.S. has not managed to bring about a two-state solution. On the other hand, some people say the Trump plan would vanish in that case, like as if it was all theater. And I'm curious to know what you can imagine a Democratic leadership would do on this issue.
I think that we will have two issues when a Democrat steps into the White House. One is the Palestinian issue, which we mentioned. The other one is Iran. We should not forget that Biden was vice president in 2015 when the Iran deal was reached, and I'm sure that he will pronounce his support for this deal. There will be certainly a return of the United States to the deal, and Israel will be, I think, isolated in this respect, and it will have to somehow charter its way under these circumstances. The second issue, that is the Palestinian one, we have to remember that ever since 1969, the U.S. position on the issue of borders, until Trump came out with his plan, was that the border between the two entities, Israel and the Palestinian one, will be based on the 67 line with minor rectification. I quote, this was William Rogers, the then Foreign Secretary of State, and then even when President Bush in 2004 wrote to Sharon, then the Prime Minister, he said that some of the settlements will remain under Israel. If you take all the area of the settlements, it doesn't come to up to 5%. This is insubstantial change in the 67 line. There is a departure in the Trump plan from that element. I have to assume that a Democrat president or even a Republican different president will return to this principle. And this is going to be a major contention issue between the two states, the United States and Israel. And I'm not surprised. I'm against annexation, a unilateral one. If there is an agreement, it's a different story. But I have to say that when I look at the international scene right now, the circumstances will, in my view, will never recur. You have a president who supports this move. You have an international community which is divided, deeply divided, not only China and the U.S., Europe and the U.S.
Yes, we're going to talk about Europe at length, yes.
Yeah, and so, and the corona crisis, which overwhelms every other issue. And so therefore, I'm against annexation. But if I were to support it, these are the unique circumstances.
But the question is whether Israel still needs the United States to the same extent that it did in the past. Because, if you look at the Palestinian armed resistance, it's been all but resolved, in inverted commas. All the countries that used to pose a certain threat, military threat to Israel, are now in tatters, whether it's Syria or Iraq. And even Iran, they've been overwhelmed by COVID and other economic woes. Maybe Israel doesn't really need the United States that much, and therefore, they don't feel the urgency to move ahead diplomatically.
You're right, in the necessity, the immediate necessity for the daily security issues. We can take care of ourselves easily, even if the United States were to suspend all military support for Israel tomorrow morning. There isn't, I agree with you, there isn't a major, substantial threat to Israel, although we have to remember that there are enemies around Israel with capabilities of causing a significant damage. Take, for example, the arsenal of missile rockets held by Hezbollah. So it will take few days for Israel to take care of this threat if it is coming into use, but we can manage. The issue of Iran is more complicated, and given the situation where Iran has certainly violated the agreement, it's not clear whether it will not further violate the agreement. Let me remind you that the whole issue of missiles has not been part of the 2015 agreement. And so there are certain security issues. Now, I added in the beginning the element of vetoing resolutions in the Security Council. When and if the Security Council takes a decision on the basis of Chapter 7 of the Charter, of the UN Charter, which includes sanctions, never happened before, but could, and the United States is not there to veto such a resolution, we are in trouble. And so it is important, and I remind you again, no other state member of the permanent member with a veto power has used this power besides the United States.
Let me use Gilad's question now as a segue to talk about the relationship with the EU, where you did serve as an ambassador. I mean, what Gilad said about America and whether Israel is really dependent on America anymore seems to me at least as much of a question when it comes to the EU. I mean, the EU is, of course, one of Israel's top trade partners. But on the other hand, Israel has done a good job under Prime Minister Netanyahu of cultivating numerous other alliances, as you started to talk about in the beginning, non-traditional alliances, including even in parts of the Middle East, has robust trade partners and plenty of markets for sales of its own exports. How much does Israel really need the EU, especially given how divided the EU itself is among the member states with relation to Israel?
For me personally, the EU-Israel relations is a big disappointment. I personally invested a lot of time in this issue. I negotiated on behalf of Israel the association agreement, which is the basis of the current relations. And I look at what remains of their relations, and this is very, very disappointing. I describe myself as the last pro-European Israeli.
So who disappointed you? Who let you down? Which development led to that disappointment? I
think the EU is the major culprit. It's not the only one. Israel has a lot of blame in that. But the EU is a very rigid organization. As you mentioned in the beginning, my being a negotiator with the Palestinians, I came out of the 2000 Camp David summit with the realization that the two sides, not blaming this one or another, the two sides are incapable of reaching a comprehensive solution at this time. It doesn't mean that I accept the status quo. It means that we have to look for a different paradigm in order to get to the two-state solution. I tried to convince my European friends during my tenure in Brussels, after this tenure ended, stick to the two-state solution, but look for other ways, for example, interim agreements, partial agreements, which eventually lead to the two-state solution. No, the EU is still stuck in this formula which hasn't changed since, I think, 1980, the Venice Declaration. And so this is issue number one. And number two, the EU decided that they won't hold the dialogue that is called for in the association agreement, the meetings of the Association Council, yearly meeting, which is part of every agreement the EU has with other states, since, I think, 2012, we haven't had one single association council. And this is the forum where the differences, political different views, are supposed to be discussed. It's not only the Palestinian-Israeli issue. We have now the issue of Turkey in the East Mediterranean, for example, which is a concern to both the EU and Israel. We have the issue of China, which is a concern to both the EU and Israel. We certainly have the Palestinian issue. No meeting in the last 8 to 9 years. And this is not the Israeli decision. This is the EU decision. All my pleas with my friends in Brussels failed. And the result is that the Israeli government, mostly the prime minister, decided we can develop bilateral relations. Look at the honeymoon that we have with Greece and Cyprus over the issues of the concern by Turkey, the issue of possible pipeline of the natural gas from the East Mediterranean to Europe. In my view, it will never happen. But this is the major issue, the two major issues which united these guys.
I mean, or the honeymoon, we're having honeymoon with other individual countries like Hungary and Poland. What do you think? Why do you think we have that honeymoon?
This is in my view. It's good to have these relations, but it cannot be a substitute to a dialogue, difficult as it is, with the central institutions of the EU. But this is not our decision. The EU refused to have these relations or these meetings at the highest political level. And the result is that Israel is saying, you want to have only the economic relations functioning? Fine. We'll follow that.
Yeah, because what does Israel have to lose? I mean, or what does it have to gain by closer diplomatic ties, as you suggest? Because right now, the trade agreements are very auspicious for Israel. They really have, I mean...
In English, we say you can have your cake and eat it too, or why buy the cow when you already get the milk? If Israel has these robust economic relationships with the EU, what is the diplomatic aspect even add?
I mentioned several problems. I mentioned the current Turkish ambitions in the East Mediterranean.
Okay, yes, you did. One. Yes.
Are difficult for us and for the EU. I mentioned China, a major issue. For Israel, it will be very important to at least learn how the Europeans intend to deal with this issue and maybe, I would say, hide behind the ties of the EU in responding to the challenges both by the United States on their relations with China and the Chinese threat. And you can mention also the Iranian issue. Yes, we can have bilateral discussions with what is called the E3, Britain, Germany, and France, but the negotiations are conducted by Brussels on behalf of these three, and it would be useful to have a conversation also with the EU on this issue. Problems of the Hezbollah, and more than that, if and when the issue of the annexation passes, certainly if the Israeli government does not take a decision to annex, then it opens up the possibility of major economic projects with the Palestinians, with the Jordanians, and we will need the EU not only as financing, but also as giving the political umbrella under which we can have this the dialogue towards the implementation of certain projects.
Okay. I mean, let me ask you, you talked about the responsibility of the EU for this deterioration, but you said also Israel has some responsibility. So I'm curious what you think is Israel's responsibility, and how will annexation, if it happens, affect that?
Let me deal with the second half of your question, because I think that there is, on the one hand, there is a sort of disregard in Israel and not taking the possible potential EU reaction to annexation. On the other hand, when I look at the current EU and the need for all political security decisions to be taken unanimously, that is to say, that it's sufficient for one state to say no, and there is no decision, for example, to impose certain sanctions on Israel in case of annexation. So this is a picture. I think that the question of, for example, the Trump plan in the context of our relations with the EU, I would say, and by the way, the statement made by the High Representative Borrell after the last meeting of the foreign ministers of the EU indicated that some of what I'm going to say has been accepted. And that is that the Trump plan can be part of the platform on which the Israelis and Palestinians could negotiate. That is to say, the Arabs will come to the table, the Palestinians will come to the table with the Arab initiative. That is to say, they will say the Arab initiative says 1967 borders, East Jerusalem the capital, just and comprehensive solutions to the refugee problems. Fine, Israel will come with the Trump, and there is a possibility the two sides will reach an agreement on what exactly they will negotiate. Probably it won't be much different from what we negotiated in the past. The problem, I repeat, we failed 5 times because the paradigm didn't change. We tried in the past to solve all the problems. It was based on whole or nothing. That is to say, it was binary. Either you solve it, or all of the problems, or you don't. And I think it's time to change. And I think that if we could, first of all, adopt this approach in Israel, I have to remind all of us that it's still not the policy of Israel. But if we go this line and the government of Israel adopts it, and we can convince the Europeans, and if we can convince the Europeans, it's a major step. Because if you look right now, the Palestinians go mostly to the European countries in the attempt to gain recognition as a state. I wish them luck. I'm not facetious, but it won't change the situation on the ground by one iota.
Mm-hmm. And so why are you exactly an opponent of annexation, as the New York Times recently quoted you? They said you are an opponent of annexation. You said it yourself. Why?
I am against the annexation because primarily, in the long run, if we want to remain a Jewish, a democratic, and moral state, you cannot combine the two. Annexation, certain annexation with many Palestinians, and remain all of the three. It's impossible. And I always say my parents came to what was then Palestine in 1933, not because of the Holocaust. Hitler just came to power in 1933. This was not then the reason. They came because they were Zionists. They wanted to live in a predominantly Jewish society. I inherited it. I told my children, my grandchildren, that this is what we should strive for.
Ambassador Eran, Germany is now acceding as president of the EU. Do you think that it will change anything, if at all?
Or what should it change?
This is going to be a very difficult presidency for many reasons. One, because of the situation, domestic situation in Europe. The Chancellor is retiring. Everyone knows it. There is an uncertain situation in the United States, and it's going to be quite a difficult presidency. As far as we are concerned, there are two situations. If we annex, Germany will not be able to stop the calls for sanctions against Israel. It could moderate the reactions, but I don't think that they are going to be able to stop the pressures. And so it may end up by some, maybe even minor, but some action taken by the EU, provided they can reach an agreement. And so this is issue number one. Number two, I think that it will be more and more difficult for German politicians to defend every Israeli actions on account of the horrible past. And there is a young generation in Germany which doesn't disregard the past, but it takes it in a different, or looks at it in a different way, certainly willing to be critical of Israel much more than the older generations. And I think that this is something which we have to take into account. Once again, the same, I would say, concern that I mentioned about the U.S. demographic changes, also true about Germany in this case.
All
Okay.
right, Ambassador Oded Eran, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And thank you to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. And thank you to Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write whatever you like. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.